When I first started watching Mamoru Hosoda's Wolf Children, I was really blown away. Besides having a heartfelt and emotional story, it's a film with a delicate, soft touch. The build-up to its final climax feels natural, and the emotional payoff of seeing a mother come to terms with her children growing up was something I hadn't really experienced in any other film up to that point. You know a movie's good when you still think about it for days afterwards, and that's exactly what I found myself doing with this film. But why do some films dig their hooks into our brains for ages like that, while others are passed off as fun but ultimately fleeting entertainment? For me at least, it has to do with how well a film can communicate and explore themes or bigger questions on life and what it's all about. That's not to say that I think a film has to have a set opinion or moral per se, but if I think about what movies have stuck with me, it's those that can dig a little deeper than just a surface level story. In the medium of film, story is of course important, but how it's paired with visuals can be the big distinguishing factor in how thematic undertones can land. Wolf Children is a great example where visuals help to tell a story, but also reinforces themes for them to have a greater impact. What really struck me when rewatching this movie is just how much the visuals play a part in just generally telling the story, not even starting on themes. And how Hosoda's choices and shots and recurring motifs do so much more than clunky dialogue ever really could. Right from the start, we begin getting a sense of who these characters are through simple shots and visuals. Wolf Guy, who I'm going to call that from now on because he doesn't actually get a name in this movie, I realized on a second rewatch. He's really aloof at first in his words, but later he can be seen helping a child who's fallen over. The saying about how you behave when you think no one's watching certainly comes to mind. As we later get to know him more, we're shown a lot of far-off, kind of cold shots as he enters people's homes as a mover. He's entering houses, but he doesn't actually have a home of his own, something he later mentions to Hana. With Hana, we see similar shots of her from far off, closing in a little more, but still showing she's alone. What's really nice is that we then get those shots repeated, but later with both of them together. It's so simple, but it really makes this montage work and helps give you a sense of time passing and people growing closer. The visuals help to efficiently tell us what we need to know without sacrificing any of our empathy for these characters. There are also, of course, the more obvious recurring visual motifs. The flowers Wolf Guy regularly gets Hana are obviously her namesake, or her name means flower in Japanese, and a reflection of his love for her, but they also hint at his sense of home, wild flowers in the mountains of his youth. They're everywhere in the dream sequences, and they're also in the mountains when Ame begins his training under Sensei the Fox. There's also the use of rain being symbolic of separation and loss, but also of new beginnings afterwards. All of these reflect a focus on using visuals to tell a story and enhance emotion, and that's just in the first act of the movie. Given the level of visual, efficiency or effectiveness, whatever you want to call it, given that level is present throughout the rest of the movie, how does Hosoda use visuals to not only help tell the story, but also make it clear what he's trying to explore or say? The film's obviously about being a parent and watching your kids grow up. There are, however, other related sub-themes in this movie that I think are worth highlighting, and that I thought were also strengthened by being shown through the visuals. A big theme that pervades the film is around conformity versus nonconformity. How can we healthily grow and express our core identity and self, and not live our lives endlessly reacting and adapting to external pressures from others and our environment? This is something that we all struggle with. Who can forget the self-consciousness and peer pressure of childhood, right through to high school and even beyond for a lot of us? I think when discussing this theme, it's easy to fall into this trap of saying that conformity is quote-unquote bad, and nonconformity is fantastic and admirable. And sure, it's always better to be true to yourself, but I think in reality it's a little more complicated and that view is a little simplistic. All of us wish we could live our lives without a care in the world about how we're perceived, becoming perfect self-actualizers who do as we please and have a strong, confident sense of self. But in reality, we're all pretty social creatures. Not only are we, to a certain extent, products of our environment, we're almost always subjected and influenced by the perceptions of others. Even if other people don't affect your self-perception, their reaction to your actions can still affect you, and that's something that we have to take into account at the very least. So what's best? How can we come to a healthy expression of self while taking into account that we're all part of a bigger picture and subject to different forces within our environment? How do we surpass societal and peer pressures and come to stand up for ourselves, or perhaps even for someone or something else? I think all three family members of the household tackle this theme in different ways, and each one gives a bit of a nuanced answer. Hana deals with this theme from the perspective of a mother, obviously. It's less about her dealing with conformity in her own life, but more about how she wants to protect her children as best she can from society's pressures. Obviously, Hana does not want anyone to know that the kids are half wolf. From their early childhood, we can see pressures from society to conform and fall in line pushing into their life, as Hana does her best to keep them at bay. Much of this is efficiently done through visuals. She tries to keep Ame and Yuki from playing with other kids too much, going to more isolated parts of a park, or taking the kids out at weird hours of the day. She also feels the pressure of unwanted attention from people. She deals with pesky neighbors, a landlord, and social workers who demand to know why she hasn't fallen in line. She eventually moves to the countryside to escape all of that, but also so the kids can have a choice as to how they grow up, rather than being forced into a path through external pressure. It's worth noting through all of this that Hana never thinks that the kids should just suppress their wolf side and stay human for good. She chooses to let them express that side of themselves. Hana isn't naive though. She knows that she can't keep her children isolated forever. She tells the kids they need to conform at least a little bit. Letting their raw individuality run wild can get them hurt, in trouble, or worse. Both of the kids' stories deal with this theme in different ways. With Ame, there's a lot of introspection around what place there is in the world for wolves, and the consequences of yielding to society's pressures to conform. As a kid, Ame cries and asks his mom why the wolf is always the bad guy and hated by everyone. Hana only tells him what a supportive mother should, that she likes them all the same. Ame's also heavily influenced by his meeting with the captive wolf, an animal that was forced down through pressures from birth at a Moscow zoo, literally a wolf forced to stay within the confines of human society. Ame asks if his father was like that and is relieved to hear he wasn't. The visuals tell us all we need to know about Ame's thoughts. He just can't accept a version of his future where he's so locked down and caged in this empty, primitive room. As he decides to follow down the path of becoming a wolf, Yuki and Ame both clash as they see each other as pressures or disapproval of each other's paths. During their clash, they even knock over their father's shrine, including their father's driver's license, which I really took as a symbol of his integration into human society. And that wrecking of the shrine kind of reflects the inability for at least these two characters to have both worlds in their lives. Ultimately, Ame feels the burden of responsibility to become master of the mountain, and he chooses to live for that greater cause, allowing him to grow, mature, and express a healthy sense of self-identity. Finally, we see the theme explored most strongly in Yuki's plotline. While at the start she's the most eager to show off her wolf form and does so at great risk, soon social pressures of school turn her lycanthropy into a burden or a shameful secret. As she goes to school, Yuki begins to feel shame for the first time. She doesn't like the other girls, and she desires to fit in, as her true self is making the other girls literally run away from her. As she adapts to social pressures, she can be seen visually becoming a part of the classroom and the community. When Sohei eventually arrives and starts questioning her about her smells and dog smells, we get a visual of her washing her hands in shame. Again, no words are spoken. The visuals tell us all we need to know. She's literally trying to wash off a core part of herself. Yuki eventually clashes with Sohei, and that gives her a more mature understanding of what's at stake. She's no longer the little girl who transformed when she felt like it. She becomes frustrated with herself, suffering self-loathing at a core part of who she is. Hana cannot intervene, but she can only support her as a mother. It's really interesting to contrast the visuals here of wolf form Yuki running freely around the yard versus the human form Yuki just crying in this restricted small car seat with a seatbelt on. Ultimately, Yuki comes to terms with herself through a relationship with Sohei, consciously revealing who she is to him and being accepted for who she is. She too chooses her path and can come to have a healthy expression of herself through raw honesty to another person, independent of social pressures. This is a nice visual metaphor as well for learning to find your first relationship or love or someone outside your family you can truly be honest with as you mature. In the end, I think that Wolf Children offers a nuanced take on conformity versus nonconformity. It's important to be true to ourselves and to consciously make decisions that help us to be honest. At the same time, the film acknowledges how hard that can be, and that for each of us that journey is a unique one, subject to different external pressures that push us to unique outcomes. In fact, the two children actually choose polar opposite paths, and both have been able to develop and grow, gaining a better sense of who they are in the process. Ame choosing to be a wolf isn't seen as him escaping the human world, but rather he chooses to take on a role greater than himself, to protect the mountain and its natural inhabitants. Yuki staying human isn't seen as some big failure or fall to peer pressure. It's something she chooses to do for another person, and she has a healthier understanding and acceptance of herself and her place in the world by the end. Another semi-related theme to this conflict between conformity and nonconformity is how experience, or external forces, kind of shape us more than abstract attempts at quick learning or knowledge. You can see it in Yuki's storyline. She can get all the written and verbal warnings in the world, but only a truly scary brush with reality when she's lashing out and revealing her wolf form to Sohei. That's what gives her a true understanding of the consequences her actions could have. Experiences are the external influences that shape us and inform our development, and it's not anything to do with abstract thinking or knowledge. Besides the story beats, the visuals again help reinforce this theme, mainly by dissing on books. I've mentioned this picture book that Hana made to warn the kids that's totally ineffective, but there's also a bunch of other times where Hana hits the books and it's the most useless activity she could ever partake in. She tries to read to help with her pregnancy, to help understand the lives of wolves, and to become a better farmer, and each time it seems to be pretty useless. Only actual experience helps her to develop into those roles. Of course, it makes sense in some ways. You don't become a perfect parent just by reading a million parenting books. Ultimately, you're going to learn the most on the job. Personally, though, I wouldn't say that means that the parenting books have no value. The reason I think this ties in so nicely with the conformity-nonconformity theme is that it makes it clear that we don't live in isolation. We're shaped by external forces and experiences and develop through our reactions to them. And that ties in nicely, I think, with the last theme that I think is worth mentioning. The separation or split between nature and the human world is another underlying theme that I think is handled quite deftly, tying into the other themes of the movie. There's an obvious aspect to this, of course. The children are half wolf, half man, and straddle both worlds until each decides to ultimately live in one of them. The separation and incompatibility between the two is emphasized in a lot of ways. Just before Ame and Yuki have a fight, it starts to become clear that it's probably not possible for them to live in both worlds, as he describes just how much he's learning. When Wolf Guy first reveals himself, rather than, going to a private room or like Hana's apartment where no one's going to see them, he instead shows his form surrounded by nature instead of staying in the concrete city. And of course, ultimately for him, showing his wolf form within that crowded city is what leads to his demise. I don't think that the film is implying that humans and nature should just go their separate ways, however. There are a lot of little hints that I think show that Hosoda thinks that we shouldn't just separate ourselves from nature, but instead we should strive to understand that we aren't really separate, we're always a part of it. Even early on, before the story moves to the countryside, as Hana begins to raise her children and takes on the role of motherhood, we see a bird coming to its nest to feed its young. It's maybe a bit of a heavy-handed parallel, but it just shows that nature's never far off, even in the middle of the city. Similarly, when Hana begins to try farming and starts making comments along the lines of, "Gee, farming sure is hard, but the nature around here is really pretty," the farmer corrects her and points out how naive she is. Nature isn't a prop for human enjoyment, but it's what we live off of, if we're farmers especially, and is worthy of respect and understanding. Farming by hand is similarly an activity that straddles the line between the human world and raw nature, and is very much glorified in this movie. The message I take from it all is that while in reality we may be quite disconnected, coming closer with the natural world is definitely something to aspire to, even if it's not fully possible for us now. Hana learns to adapt and develops herself as she becomes a farmer, but no amount of wholesome farming success montages can ever make Hana a member of the natural world in the way that her children are. She's simply come too far along in life and has had a different upbringing and external influences. This is exactly the same for all parents, of course. The world is simply too big, and our capacity for understanding can only go so far, and so chances are high that we can never understand or follow along on all the paths that our children choose to take. We see this explored in the finale of the film when Hana goes looking for Ame in the rainy mountains. Ame's slipping into the world of nature already, where his mother can't follow, and that's foreshadowed early on when lightning smashes their lights out, reflecting how thin the barrier between the worlds is at their house. Meanwhile, the same sequence is repeated at the school, where Yuki is, and the lights stay firm. As Hana ventures into the forest, it becomes clear that, despite her intentions being to save her child, it's really her who's in need of saving here. She's wearing this bright yellow coat that sticks out like a sore thumb, further reflecting how much she just doesn't belong here. Her willingness to venture beyond her world and understood experience is admirable, but her efforts are in vain. I think this is demonstrated best by the scene with the mother bear. This is probably my favorite scene in the whole movie, just because it's dripping with thematic meaning, and not a word is said or even a musical note played. The bear doesn't even have facial features. Nature remains this unknowable and dangerous force for Hana, and she'll never be able to fully integrate into it. She'll never be a mother in nature in the way that the mother bear is, and her son has entered this world and has his own abilities, preferences, and personhood. She'll never fully understand that world, and no amount of experience can teach her. To drive the point home, Hana's ultimately saved from the forest by Ame, and he brings her back to the concrete ground of a parking lot. Hana is a character stuck in one world who must try and help children who can straddle two. In the same way, parents can't possibly understand, know, and be prepared for all the paths their children choose to walk, but all they can do is support them as they find their own way. Wolf Children is by no means a perfect film. That furry bestiality sex scene is weird and really stops me from recommending this to more people than I'd like to. And Hana as a character is just a little too saintly for my taste. I don't think any real mother has this much patience. Still, I think it tackles complex, universal themes in a deft and nuanced way. It's a truthful meditation on the struggles of our lives, looking into how we can keep a core part of ourselves and grow as human beings, whilst also acknowledging the impact of our experiences in the wider world.